I apologize for the disruption because I am at my universities and I'm sure the internet connection is not at best condition. Um, Thank you for the wonderful presentation, both of you, and I would like to share the idea concerning the two presentation. First of all, you guys both make a wonderful combine the examination of examination, not jury. Uh,
I cannot hear.
because it makes a perfect sense of two imperial project for the Vietnamese colonization, the Vietnamese imperialism, and then the French colonizations. And both of them have to deal with the environment, have to deal with the frontier, have to deal with the territory, have to deal with uh, uh, how to reorganize human society and human conditions of the Vietnamese populations, and therefore they they established a huge impact on the nature. Uh, and what Bradley David presented make a perfect sense for the second presenter, for Emmanuel, because uh, it gives a background, a perfect background for what is going on when the French came to Vietnam. They observed the nature and they
I cannot hear. Bradley, Andrew, you can hear, or it's
No, I think his signal is probably cutting in and out.
okay. I think we have lost him. Difficult.
Well, I might send him a well.
Yes, Liam, if you hear us, we cannot hear you. So anyway, it is okay now. Now we cannot. Okay, I'm chatting with him. So.
Yeah, difficult. Everybody can't hear. I think Liam. So perhaps perhaps we can ask. There is a set of questions with the different people attend this webinar. It's always very difficult, the technical problem, particularly in Vietnam, because the connection are weak in university, and this is a problem that we have to address in the future, because it's very frustrating not to have the Liam's commentary.
Okay, I think Liam, you came back or not? Okay, so we will open the floor for the discussion, and maybe we will come back later with the Liam presentation. And anyway, we will have a report of the session. So Liam will write what he planned to say, and we will share with everybody on the website of the seminar. So if someone wants to say something, please raise a hand or open your microphone to comment. Okay.
Can I make a comment,
Yeah, please,
Anu?
please, Andrew.
First of all, to say thank you to both presenters and to reiterate the point that Liam was trying to make, that this this seminar has been very interesting for the comparative imperialist view that we've received, and to get, you know, two people working on two different but overlapping imperialisms has been really very interesting. There's a sort of general comment that I'd like to make, and also a question for Bradley. But to start off with a comment for Frederic, which is about your citation of Pinot de Béarn. This is just a minor comment, but it opens up into a broader area, and that list of products was very much the list of products that we see coming out of the port of Hoi An. My point being that if we want to understand the forest of at least the central region, we just have to look at the products at Hoi An. And it also corresponds very closely to the list of products that you see being picked up by the Arab traders in Champa, or being accepted by the Chinese state as a tribute by the Champa kingdom.
I'm back and
these sources, and these are real, written sources. The Ming Shilu is online in English. The Arab traders have been translated into French and English by different colonial period authors. These sources, I think, give you another angle to approach your question about the riches of the forest of Indochina before the French period. My reading of those sources suggests that the Dengguan region, at least up until the Daesun period, maybe not after that, but that transitional period, the Dengguan region was one of the richest regions in Southeast Asia, just judging by the wealth that was exported from it. So, I mean, I take your point very, very strongly about barren Indochina. This is really interesting. But when you look back at the huge civilization that the Cham kingdom built on the basis of exporting this wealth from the forests, you wonder, how did it go wrong under the Nguyen? So, in a way, this is taking your perspective and throwing it back to Bradley. Where did this go wrong in the pre-French period? So that the French arrived and found the environment of the hinterland already in a state of, should we say, disrepair. My second point is something that came out of both of your presentations. Frederic's in your mention of the forest enemy, and Bradley in your portrait of the Muang binary with the Pa. And I think that this binary we find all across the different multicultures of Indochina. Whether it's the Thai Muang, whether it's the central highlands, the highlanders of Teng Nguyen, there are no trees in their villages. The forest is outside the village, and there's a clear binary between the civilized Banar or Jarai or whatever Highlander group we're talking about. The village, no trees, the forest is outside. And then, of course, the king, where the trees are all in the village, and the rest of the place is rice fields with a minimum of tree cover. And for the king, the binary is a different matter, because while the Highlanders regard the forest as a resource in a very sustainable and we understand that. I don't need to go into that issue. The King have a very strong forest enemy mentality, where the forest landscape is a very different place from the farmed landscape, where the wilderness is opposed to the space of civilization, where the forest is a place of danger, and the farming area is a place of safety, and where, above all, and I think this is really essential to at least to the mentality side of this question, the forest is a place of sickness because of the whereas the plain is a place of health. So I think that this issue of environmental mentalities is something that Bradley raised also when he was talking about the environmental sensibility and the way that the Vietnamese developed an environmental sensibility. It's quite difficult for us to imagine how different this set of mentalities was from our own regard on our own gaze on the forest. We're always regarding the forest as a positive thing, but here forest is really the enemy, as you said. And once you regard the forest as the enemy, then you start to also wonder about other enemies. And this is my final point and question for Brad, which is that your story about the Dong Dien, the military agricultural colony, you mentioned these Lao raiders or Highlander raiders in the early part of the example. And I wondered whether the project for dominance over the environment appears in the sources as a project of border defense. Is this articulated in the sources? Is there a sort of policy awareness of this as the environmental answer to a border defense issue? Or is it articulated in terms of agricultural development, in terms of environmental dominance? In other words, we need to get rid of this forest, turn it into farms, and there's no further, it doesn't take the analysis further into the military side. So that in a sense is a question for Brad. But in any case, thank you to both of you for a fascinating, for me, morning.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, for the relevant comments and question. Bradley, Frederic, you want to say something, answer? Please.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Perhaps Bradley, you want to start to answer to the different remark of Andrew?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks.
Leave you the floor.
So, yeah, how did it go wrong under the wind? There was a very long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, when I was, I think I just finished my thesis, and I was presenting at a conference, and Alex Woodside asked me the same exact question. He said, "Well, this is all very interesting. So what happened? Is it what you've described as well represented in sources, and it's very easy to talk about. So what happened? I think the explanations for what happened are many, but I think that one of the advantages of viewing things from an environmental perspective is that we might actually be able to answer questions like that by looking at a much more regional reality from when Vietnam, rather than just viewing the period before French colonialism as the precursor to the collapse of the imperial dynasty and the beginning of French colonialism. I can see a way that maybe an accelerated exploitation of forest space would have really been supported by some of these conceptual changes that were happening during the Nguyen. You're absolutely right to mention that the forest was a place of sickness historically, and people talked about the miasma, the bad air of the forest, and all of this. And from the other perspective, and Jonathan Padway at Hawaii is doing work on this right now, there's a sense that there's what we now call acquired immunity for malaria, whereby people who live in the uplands see the plains as a place of disease and sickness because they lose the immunity they have to the particular kind of pathogen that the mosquito transmits if they leave the mountains. But in terms of a tree line, I mean, forests are also places where bandits go. They're also places where refugees go. They're places where criminals go. And they're places that bandits come out of, and they're places that criminals come out of. There's almost like a foreboding there beyond the tree line. And I think you're absolutely right about generalizable to Southeast Asia. I would say generalizable, period, really. I mean, there's this idea of people in the, I mean, but without sounding too fancy, Thucydides talks about this, the polis and the ethne, and then there's the people in the city who we all understand, and then there's these other people. I think there's even a line in Epictetus that talks about how you need to avoid the forest because there's dangers in the forest. You know, so I feel like there's a generalizable thing about that, but then also from the perspective of people in the forest, you know. And just very briefly, before I throw it back to Frederick, I'm borders. I almost see a kind of territoriality at work here. Not to use an overvalued word for a somewhat easy idea. It absolutely is talked about in terms of border defense, but it's also talked about in terms of control of the population. And that has to do with tax revenues, and that has to do with, do you have people farming? You can project tax revenues if you can control prices of certain staple grains if you have people producing them, for instance. Relying on the whims of forest agriculture is great if you live in the forest and if you have the generational knowledge of exactly what that entails. But from the perspective of a lowland state that just wants to fill up the Ministry of Revenue, that's not as satisfying. And your comment though, Andrew, also reminded me of a line in a 15th century source about forest. It's from the Nguyen Chai collected works. I can't remember who the author was, but he talks about going up into the mountains in the sort of the central part of Vietnam and saying that their forests are only good for graves. In other words, there's a differentiation. I mean, there are forests that can produce trees that are valuable, and as you suggested, could be traded if need be, as the Cham had done. And then there are forests that are good for graves. You know, that's what you grow there. You grow corpses.
Okay, thank you. Frédéric, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to perhaps give a short answer about the question what's happened between the two presentations we have done with Bradley. It's a very interesting question, very difficult to answer, of course, because as I try to show, to write environmental history is a very difficult topic from the interpretation and gathering of sources on the way to stem information from different sources. But I have perhaps it's not a very good underpinning hypothesis, but in 2000 I wrote an article about the shortage of woods in the market in Saigon at the end of the 19th century. The title of this article, you will find it in the bibliography on our website, is Cochin China, first wood forest shortage. I don't remember exactly the title of my own article, but it's something like first approach. And in this article, I try to give a few answers of what's happened during the first decades of the colonization, why we have a so accurate shortage in the providing of timber in the big market like Saigon. And it is clear that with this during the 10, 20 first years of intervention of French in Cochinchina, so since 1860, 61, all the traditional Chinese trade with minority, with Vietnamese, have been totally changed. And the way that the wood exploitation have been done during these short decades, I think was very, very, very destroying way against the colonists. So I think there have been a lot of wastage at that time, but we should work more on this period, perhaps to find some answer about what's happened between the end of the UN rulers and the environment and the beginning of colonial ruling. About the question also, the question of forest culture or forest people, I totally agree, and I want to underline your idea, Andrew, that actually when we go in the anthropologic colonial sources, there are some very good. We know that the people that from King point of view, Chinese point of view, French point of view, was people from forest, was not at all from forest. The forest was always outside the culture of civilization, were even in the highland civilization of rice, as Jacques Dourne show, or many other anthropologists from the period, the post-colonial period. On this literature, I think I will be very happy to organize another session of this case, because through the colonial anthropology, we can have a good idea of what was exactly the ethnic agricultural system in the forest, but their civilization still outside the forest. Even in Nous avons mangé la forêt de Georges Condaminas, it's very clear that the Hmong are not a civilization of forest, but are civilization of rice. And it's very important to recall this. You are right, Andrew.
Okay, Mr. Liem, you want maybe to make a comments about the question of the scale of natural exploitation in the pre-colonial Vietnam? Please, Liem.
Manu? Who here? Liem?
Yeah,
Yes.
in fact, we continue the discussion with the chat. Liam is writing some ideas about the scale of natural exploitation in the pre-colonial Vietnam. I don't know, Liam, if you speak, we can hear you or not. So it shows.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Liam. Yeah.
I think the nature of the environment in Vietnam by the early 19th century have already established the theater for French colonization for the condition that Frederick mentions. If you look at the map where the Nguyen dynasty collecting resources, timber, and forest products, all of them came from the highlands area. Timber, for example, timber for shipbuilding was collected from Quang Hoa in Tây Ninh area, the area that's very close to the Vietnamese-Cambodia border. And for timber for constructing the Nguyen Imperial citadel, Imperial Forbidden City, it was collected from the upland area of Nghệ An and Thanh Hóa. So therefore, along the river, along the lowland area, the forest was disappeared by the 1800s. And the boundary of natural exploitation was put further and further to the frontier. That's why I really liked the idea by Bradley Davis that the Nguyen have to establish a frontier of resources from the frontier that the empire collecting material, collecting natural resources, collecting forest product for the trade, for their construction, and for casting a copper coin. The other thing I think is also significant is the fact that the increasing of the population, demographic growth. Now, by the 1870, the Vietnamese population was around 10 million. After 50 years of French colonization, in the early 1920, we have 20 million. 20 million. So the population of Vietnam was double by 50 years. By 50 years. The area like in the Tonkin area, it was already one of the most demographic, densely demographic distributions in the world already. So the population in the Tonkin Delta was already put a pressure on the nature in the 1500 and 1600, and therefore it coming back to the question by Andrew, the scale of human destruction of the human is exploitation of the nature. It depends on certain area in the northern Vietnam, the Sino-Vietnamese frontier, the copper mine in Cao Bằng, in Thái Nguyên, in Lạng Sơn, the forest, wood and timber were cutting down by 1700 and 1800. In the lowland of Tonkins, along the Red River deltas, by 1400 and by 1500, all the forests are already gone, especially during the period of explosion of the pottery making in 1500s and 1600s. That huge number of pottery making in the Red River deltas by 15th and 16th centuries, and you know it needs a lot of energy, and then timber was cutting down for the productions of potteries and ceramic. We go to Champa, for instance, by the 1600 and 1700, like Adu Hardy had written a paper on the hybrid nature of the Cham and Vietnamese economic conditions by the 18th and by the 17th and 18th centuries. The Vietnamese was put forward agriculture into the Cham landscape, into the Cham way of economic production that rely on nature, rely on uh, forest, uh, rely on the extractions of the forest product. And the expansion of agriculture, the expansion of village, the expansion of the Vietnamese populations uh, foster the scale of nature exploitations because the Vietnamese have more population established a right field in the village. They need more resources, they need more water, they need more timber for cooking, for constructing building, and so on and so forth. So it completely changed the way of humans' economic conditions, human society, and the way the new economic structure was established directly impact on the nature, especially on the forest. Because the relationship between human being and nature was no longer the same like the former pattern of the Cham and the nature. So we have the increasing of the population, the Vietnamese way of dealing with the nature. I would like to stress one more point. I mentioned before the idea of hương ước, and I think it is a good point to start with both of you. Hương ước is a local village, the village code of conduct. And in hương ước, we have a lot of things to talk about the relationship between families and communities, but it's also about certain rules that apply for the relationship between local villagers and the nature. For example, many places in the village was forbidden from cutting timber, like from the local temple. And they have certain rules to protect the environment as well. But the village code of conduct did not come from systematic applications or scientific applications of uh, conduct and of rule and of the way uh, the Vietnamese deal with nature, and we have to wait for friends to come, and the friends will come with scientific, with botanical garden, with the concept of nature and concept of the new way to think about the relationship between human and nature. I don't quite agree with Frederick on the point that we separate the green imperialism. We separate the colonial policies on nature and the colonial policy on economic and politics because they are the same, they came under the same umbrella of colonial design. Now, for example, you talk about Dalat and Sapa. Why Dalat and Sapa was recognized as a place of reserve, as a place of protection? Because they was designed for French to come there during the summer times. It was designed for the colonial system and colonial structure. So even the idea of colonial environment and the Green Empire is also come back to the larger picture of colonial policy to serve the empire and to serve the benefits of the French colonization. So
Okay, Liam, you finish or you have been cut? I'm not sure. Bradley, you want to answer something about the comment of Liam?
Oh, I think someone else had their hand up first. PTO, I'm not sure who that is.
Yeah, but PTO, it's a question for Frederick. So I think if you want to continue on the same topic of Liam, maybe you answer now.
Oh, well, just very, very briefly, I sent a citation into the chat box of an article from a few years ago, 2009 actually, by a team of archaeologists working in the Red River Delta. If anyone's curious to see what the long-term history of firescapes are in the Red River Delta, going back quite a ways, very, very, very interesting article to have a look at. Very digestible too for archaeology. I mean, it's hardcore archaeology, but you can get the gist of what they're doing. So I just wanted to throw that on there. Yeah, in terms of what Liam was saying, it's not to belabor the point too much, because I feel like, Liam and I and Andrew and anyone else could probably talk about the 19th century for a very long time. The work of Budong Won and also Alex Woodside has also dealt with mining up in the borders. And I think that before Liam got cut off, he was probably going to mention that there's the data for the 1770s actually comes out of Woodside wrote an article about Lake Wedon, maybe in the 1980s, where he talked a lot about Chinese mining. So that might be interesting for people. But I think that's really all I had to say, unless there was anything else.
Okay, thank you. There is a question for Frederick for PTO. Sorry, I don't know your name. So PTO, please, you can.
My initial. Hi, this is Phúc. Sorry for the initial my name. I don't know why it doesn't come up my name. Thanks a lot for the presentations. I have a question for Frederick. Frederick, you talk about 4 areas: natural conservation empire, colonial imagination of the nature, colonial conservation policies, and conservation policies. I would like to ask the questions on the role of the plantation, colonial plantation, in influencing or in shaping the these 4 areas. Because you talk about logging, but I don't hear much about plantation. And I know that colonial plantation plays a big role, rubber, for example, particularly in the Cochin China area or so. So if you could talk a little bit more about, again, the role of colonial plantation in shaping or in influencing that kind of policies, then that would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. Frederick?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, you're right. I concentrated my PhD only on forest services. So that is why I wanted to stay very focused on the action of these service forests, and that is why I didn't talk about at all about rubber plantation in Cochinchina and Cambodia too, because the border was plenty of rubber plantation. But there is not just rubber plantation, tea plantation, coffee plantation, starting at that time in some time a very high degree. Yes, this is an important. This have an important impact of course, natural on forest, natural in coma, because it was a total change in the land use, and of course it destroyed a huge space. For example, in what the French called in North Vietnam, in Tonkin, the Moyenne Région, so the middle area between the delta and the North Mountain. This is the province like Phuto I talk about a little bit, where the agricultural European concession was given to colonists. And it is clear, and this is something that is very related to forest services. It is clear that most of the time, the concession given to the European colonists, I have many sources about this story, this sort of story, was covered by quite rich forest. And the forest services have not the power, the political power to protect this forest, because the colonist lobby wants this sort of land in agricultural concession, but not to develop really agriculture, but just to cut trees. And this is a very interesting story to see that in Phuto province, for example, the province was shared between indigenous rice field, but I don't remember exactly the data, but almost 15 or 20% of this sort of province was covered by French agricultural concession that have been cut for their wood, sell for the European people, and the mise en valeur, the agricultural mise en valeur doesn't follow, and that make very angry all the forest services to say that they talk about agricultural mise en valeur, but they just want to concentrate it agricultural concession to cut the wood, and that's all. To large timber, and to compare the situation on Phuto province is a very interesting case study from this point of view, because as agricultural European concession was very huge, of course, the Vietnamese people have to entrench in the forest reserve to plant their own plantation. And it's very interesting when I talk about the declassification of the reserve during the 1930s. It's because the colonial power start to be aware that this policy was a failure, was not fair, was not environmentally efficient, that they start to diminish, to withdraw the surface of the reserve, to legalize the indigenous plantation of tea or this sort of thing I show very quickly on the map of the reserve. But you are right, the impact of agriculture concession on the forest cover was very important, but actually the French Forest Service have no power to act against this sort of policy.
Okay, thank you. You want to?
And I just want to mention too, if you want to have a very good overview of environmental social policy of rubber plantation in South Vietnam, in Cochinchina, I advise you to read the PhD of Christophe Bonneuil. Christophe Bonneuil has me an historian of science, a very good friend, and he developed his PhD about agricultural imperial science, and he compared two case studies: rubber plantation in Cochinchina and comment on dit arachide in English? arachid in English. Andrew, help me. Arachid plantation in Senegal. So if you can read French, it's a very interesting history of science and social and environmental history of rubber plantation in Cochinchina. Peanuts, thank you.
Okay, Christian, you want to share something you wrote, but maybe you can explain?
Yeah, just because I think we are a very good explanation about the economical or the industrial management of the forest and nature. But it's not only the way people were thinking at this time. The problem is on the archive. We talk a lot about the economy and the land management, but not a lot about the religion, about the art, about nature. Because this time people, the same today, it's not only the business, it's only the large way of thinking about nature. And we don't know enough about that. And I don't know, you are a historian, but about in the archive, did you find some evidence, something about how the people from the kingdom, maybe the manager of the kingdom, but also the local people, the painter, the I don't know, how they talk about nature during the imperial period. It's a big question, I know that, but it's very important to make the balance between all the rational or economical thinking about forest and the other part, some kind of art or literature or more religion also. Just a very large question, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you, Christian. Bradley, you have something, or Frédéric, about other perspective of natural representation. I think, Frédéric, you find many things in the archives about. Wait, Frédéric. Yeah.
Bradley first, perhaps.
Yeah, please, Bradley.
Yeah, to answer Christian, yes. The longer answer is that I think that what's at stake here, and I think one of the what's at stake in a lot of the work that I've been doing, and also I think that Liam has been doing, is that there is maybe an over-identification of what we've come to think of as a rational, for lack of a better term, way of viewing the exploitation of the natural world. I think Anglophone scholars have a tendency to call this Cartesian dualism. I'm not sure why. If you actually go back and read Descartes or Diderot, it's just much more complex than that. But there's a tendency to over-identify that with European colonial rule in Southeast Asia, and I think that one of the things that I've found, and not to put words in Liam's mouth, but I would guess that he's found as well, is that there's not a monopoly on damaging rationality held by European colonial administrators. That there are, they might not be quoting, Gobineau or Hegel, but there's just as much sort of philosophical justification for certain damaging things. That being said, more to Christian's point, I've seen this most clearly looking at ritual manuals and ritual texts from Mian Yao communities mostly from the area around Lao Cai province in contemporary Vietnam. And this is the contemporary practice today that has to do with understandings of the natural world as permeated with animating spirits, understandings of the natural world that have to do with balance and negotiation, that have to do with things that are very, very different than just, as I think Christian is right to criticize, kind of like the basement of ideology is sort of like very rationalistic economics of it.
Yes, Frédéric.
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're right, Christian. The question is rather important. Does really the colonial management of environment was just, as I tried to explain, sustainable development means some classical economics rules to to assure a sustainable use of resources, and that's all, and never deal with the question that I want to underline in my introduction of lands ethics, spirituality with nature, even if it's not Protestant spirituality, but Confucianism spirituality. Bradley speak a little bit about this kind of notion of qi with the good management of the non-human and human in the Confucian philosophy, and I think all these kind of things must be discussed further has a real matter, because actually perhaps it's not first the same sources for historians, perhaps it's not the same kind of works. When I work on my anthropological colonial sources I was just mentioned before, it's a very difficult work, because I can't work with this kind of source as a classical historian. So I think we have to devote a special session to this question. But to answer a little bit to your question, I would say that what I want to show, and perhaps I didn't show it very clearly because English is always for me a big challenge, is that yes, the way of rational economy, rational lodging, homogenization of the forest to have a sustainable management of the resources is totally dominant in the second period of 19th century and all the 20th century. And that is why, and perhaps Liam doesn't understand what I want to say by separating green imperialism, ecological imperialism, and sustainable economy. It's precisely to underline that all the other way to see the nature differently than resources have been totally forget during this long period of engineering, of economic rationality. And perhaps I'm not totally in contradiction with Groove, because actually Groove worked on more on the 18th century, and as Groove show in figures like Pierre Poivre, Commerson, etc., these people really describe the tropical nature with a lot of love and admiration. And I talk about very quickly about Alexander von Humboldt during my introduction. It was especially to recall, by contrast, that during the 19 and industrial colonization, we have not to forget that the spirit of that time was very different than the spirit of the 18 great travelers. And in this engineer, Chiapello and Boltanski would talk about the économie des grandeurs, the city of the greatness, the discourse of justification, the aesthetics, the spiritual relationship with nature doesn't disappear totally in individual, but it have no flaw for develop a special policy of real preservation. And that is why my last part was to show that the few concern of preservation still during the colonization, wishful thinking, and it was very scarce.
Thank you, Frederick. So it's beginning to be a bit late for Bradley or the colleagues, but Liam, maybe you want to make some comments. You raise some questions in the chat. So I don't know if everybody look at the chat, but Liam asked question about military plantation that was applied in a large scale during the early 19th century. So I don't know if Bradley, you have a reaction about that. And also he raised a question of the ethnic factor, the demographic shift, what role they play here. So I don't know if someone has a comment about Liam's ideas.
Yeah, just if Liam has the connection for it, I'd like to hear if he has anything else to say. And if you can end when you guys like, obviously, but don't worry, I'm not that delicate. I can't go anywhere anyway. So it doesn't really matter how late it is. Yeah, but the demographic shift is such a terrific point, because this is one area that I think historians of Southeast Asia, and specifically Vietnam, really would benefit by looking at things from a much more global perspective. Because this question of the demographic shift in the 17th and 18th century is a well-researched phenomenon for the history of China in particular. And it has a lot to do with crops from the Americas that are introduced. It has a lot to do with new areas that are open to farming. And I'd be curious to see how historians might be able to explain or account for what seems to be, a similar sort of demographic shift. Is this just a consequence of the census? Is it a consequence of how people are counted? Is it actual growth of human beings? I mean, that would be a fascinating question to know more about. And I think Liam also raises the ethnic factor with a question mark, and then cites Paul Moose, which is never a bad idea usually. Ethnicity is, I think, at the heart of a lot of these questions of environmental rule, frankly. Ethics. Oh, I see. Okay, ethos. Sorry. And I had this whole spiel I was going to do about ethnos. Sorry, Liam. That could be something a little bit different. Yeah.
Okay, but you can
but
still speak about
stuff,
ethnicity if you want to address it.
It's not unrelated. I mean, it's if you, and I've dealt with this elsewhere, but we have these, we're sort of weighed down in contemporary Vietnamese with terms and concepts for certain things that have very distinct histories and lineages. And if we talk about ethnicity in contemporary Vietnam, we're usually using a range of terms that are introduced into the Vietnamese language after the 1870s with very specific context in mind. And then they get explained with very specific context in mind in the 1920s and in the 40s and in the 50s. And then today they have a range of different meanings. But I think that if historians who look at earlier periods of Vietnamese history can somehow divorce ourselves from that a little bit, we can see things that we can see sort of processes that are not that dissimilar to ethnic differentiation really happening. And they might not use Dantop because no one had translated Bok and Jean into classical Chinese and then Japanese, and then so they don't have that particular term that has that particular lineage. But there is a differentiation of customs. The notion of Dantop is very important in imperial text, and there's even a much more open-ended understanding of things like ethnicity because it changes. There's a notion of the notion of people being able to be Han, for instance, and this is not confined to Vietnam in the 1840s, and if you go to southern China today, at least it was my experience 15 years ago, I met Zhuang people who described themselves as Han. They said, well, I've Han-huad. I've become a Han person, meaning that they live in a city and that they don't have the traditional outfit and they don't go back to their home village to do the things that traditional Zhuang people would do. And so I think that maybe it's the fault of certain researchers that might have a much more unnecessarily strictly tied down understanding of certain things like this.
Okay, Christian, you want to say something? Please.
No, I think we just make the turn about everything from the economy and the ethic, everything, and just we see how my question is how, because usually we think the economy is some kind of motor, some kind of a driver, but I'm not sure of that, because if we think opposite, we think maybe the the local philosophy, the ethic, moral, can also give the foundation for the economical action or justification for the economical action. That is a big question between the relation between what ideology is the base of action. And this, we have this kind of question for this time. But because it's history, we don't have a lot of archive about that. Usually the archive don't talk directly about that. It's been, as Frederic said, we need to have a very specific research on the archive to find the evidence about how the religion, how the art, painting, and literature can talk about nature, and to find the relation between economical action and maybe religion action or maybe art action. Thank you.
I think in your idea, Christian, perhaps there is the question on the idea, is Vietnam is a landscape culture like Japanese or China described by Augustin Berg? And I try to address this sort of question also on yes, we will have to share our point of view from this sort of question. It's important to, yes, for environmental history.
Okay, does someone else want to make a comment? I don't know, Catherine, if you read the chat or not, or if you want to say something, because we are very happy you can join the session today, and I know it's the middle of the night for you. I don't know if you hear us or not. Yeah. Okay, if nobody has anything to say, yeah.
Yeah, just really briefly, and it's just to say that it's too bad that Katie that Catherine can't join in, because her own work actually deals a lot with these questions of imperial ideology and you know.
Yeah.
I just very, very briefly, just because Christian brought up Japan, I just wanted to, Japan is a landscape culture. I mean, I understand your reference there, but you also, you know, that also, it excludes Ainu people. It excludes, you know, I mean, Japan is a landscape culture that is a just one version of relating to something like that for groups of people living in Japan. I mean, this is the sort of received, you know. So maybe as historians, it's the questions that we're asking of the sources that we have. I don't know.
Frédéric?
Yeah, to complete what Bradley just said, I would add that is a proof to develop environmental history, we have to be creative in the sources we read first, but we also seek and sometimes create. And I think the question of Christian is quite promising, because to develop all the aspect of environmental history, we have also to be very creative in the source we create as historian or as anthropologist, or never mind our discipline of our background, scientific discipline. And I want to say, from my point of view, I do with what I can do, and I show you in my talk today that for me, microhistoria is very, very important. And as Liam said, when you have sources who describe the relationship between individual in village or village in the general society, we also find some very, very interesting information about the relationship, not only between human, but also between the human and the non-human. To take a very short come to talk about environment and all this entity. And you said, Manu, in your comment, ontology of nature that can be very different, and it's always very difficult to track. But I think if we start to do collectively this work together, and if we start to develop networking with different ideas, it's very, very nice perspective, and I'm very happy of this.
Okay, so it looks like an interesting conclusion about the methodological challenge and what we can continue to do together to go further in microhistory and be creative in archives, collect and use. Liam, do you want to say something to conclude the session? If you can speak, I don't know how is the connection. Liam, okay. Catherine, I don't know if you are still here or not. Okay. So thank you everyone for joining this meeting, especially Bradley. It's late for you. Thank you very much. So we recorded everything. We will write a report. So remember, we have a website about the session. So I will send the link of the website in the chat for everybody can have it. And don't hesitate to look at the website and also to contribute in the website. There is a part dedicated to the references and the bibliography. So we want to do a kind of collective job about this bibliographical issue. So you can find on the website. Frédéric?
No, everybody has the address of the website. I want to say that we make some report of each session. Sometimes it's quite long, sorry, because we have other thing to do, of course. But if you look at, I'm not going to display, but if you look at you click on environmental history of Vietnam in the first page of this website, you will have to click of reporting the session 1 and 2, and you can listen again to our different paper if you want, and you will have also some trace of the PowerPoint on some trace sometime of the discussion. Sometimes we have technical problem, but we apologize for this. But really, we want to make this environmental website of History of Vietnam a collective work. So please don't hesitate to write to Manu or I or everybody to say we would like to add this in the website. You didn't mention this remark, it was important, etc. We are all totally open-minded of different trends, so don't hesitate to tell us the information you would like to add in this website. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone, and see you for the next session, maybe in September or October, maybe about the different ontology and relationship with nature, and maybe also the local forms of resource management. We have some Vietnamese anthropologists to work about the way local resources are managed outside the state. So we plan to make a session about these issues. Okay, thank you, Liam, also for the discussion. Bye bye.
Thank you very much, Bradley. We were very happy to welcome you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bradley.
Really nice,
Bye-bye. See you.
Nice to meet you, Frederic.
Yeah, bye bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you, Andrew.